Well, it is great to see your smile, Anika. Every time I see one of your tweets, I just break into laughter and joy. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation and for inviting me. So I think we're just going to have a back and forth
Yeah.
about today. So my first question to you is, for people who are new to this conversation about the classics, how are you defining and thinking about the classical and tradition? What's included and what's not included?
That's a wonderful question. Well, and I think I'm pretty strict, and I think sometimes that surprises people because I talk a lot about racial healing and culturally relevant teaching and literature. But I do have kind of this way where I like to protect literature traditions. I'm protective of my own, African American literature tradition and others. I kind of see it as we should protect each tradition, but then bring them in conversation with one another, right? And so when I think of the African American literature tradition or the African American tradition, there's James Baldwin, there's Martin Luther King, there's Frederick Douglass, there's Ornell Hurston, there's Toni Morrison, and then there's all of the Harlem Renaissance authors, all of those. Just to be perfectly honest, if someone were to say, we need to put just someone else in there just to kind of make it more diverse, I would say, well, that might hurt the story, that you may not know the whole story if you bring in those who may not be as connected to it. And so I feel very similar about the canon or the classical tradition or the Western tradition. And my rule is that whoever is included must be in conversation with it. Somewhere in their writing, they are referencing it. And so what is classics? And what is a classical tradition? So classics are all of that literature and culture and art and all of that is from ancient Greece and Rome. That is classics. That is the study of that. Now, there are other people groups that intersect with that in the ancient world. There's the ancient African civilizations and ancient Middle Eastern civilizations often intersect with the classics. And so I think those should also be included in that conversation because the classics authors of ancient Greece and Rome reference Egypt. They reference the Middle East. So anybody who's in that conversation is included there. That's classics. And that's usually something that's studied in the academic world, classics, the study of the ancient world, centering basically Greece and Rome, and then also touching on those that intersect in those spaces. And that space, let me just stay there for a minute. That is important to understand. And that is important that we don't cancel that story. Because whether we like it or not, that story is very foundational to a lot of knowledge and understanding that we have in America and in the world, from here to Africa even. And so instead of getting mad about that, I think we should engage with that. Be honest about some things that are connected to that, but still engage in that conversation. So that's classics. The classical tradition, or we'll say people sometimes call it the liberal arts tradition. Sometimes people even call it the humanities, is birthed out of classics. I love Mortimer Adler's understanding of it. And so that's usually who I connect with because his understanding is very philosophical. And theoretical. And so he believed that anyone included in what he called the Western canon or the classical tradition or the classical canon were in conversation with the ancient world. And that is really key. So and he even cataloged it. So this was not something he just said, I'm just going to put a bunch of people from Europe in this canon and exclude people. I like to say he tried to start a work that we're supposed to finish.
Oh, that's such an interesting way to put it.
Yep.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, he created a formula. And out of all of the traditions, it's the only one where I can logically understand the formula. And so it doesn't feel so exclusive. And should he have put more people who look like me in it? Absolutely. Based on his formula, absolutely. But I'm going to give him some grace and say, he worked so hard, 40,000 hours, they say, along with other scholars. Yes. Stringfellow Barr, Robert Hutchinson, and there's like a group of them. Some of them went on to start St. John's College or recreate the program at St. John's College, but they created this canon, and they cataloged every topic that intersects with the other, and everywhere that they reference another person. There's even a book that's out of publication now. You can find it used a lot of times on eBay and Amazon, but it's called The Great Conversation. And in this book, it's a beautiful book. Maybe later I'll even show it to you guys, and so you can find it yourselves. He shows each author in his canon and each classical author they reference in their writings. So you can see this formula.
I just put that in the chat. I don't know if other people can see it, but that's a great kind of placeholder, the great conversation. And you say it's out of print, unfortunately, but we can get it on used bookstores, used booksellers. Okay, that's fantastic. And so based on that formula, we can continue his work. Based on that formula, I can say, oh, Zorn, like anybody, no matter what ethnic group you're coming from, most likely you have authors in your heritage that have written things that are connected to this tradition. And so you can continue the great conversation. So can you give us a concrete example in your own work of how you would say, here's the classical tradition, and here's how new voices come into that? So how do you redefine the classical tradition in that way? What are some concrete examples? I think a good example, and I'm going to speak from the African-American literature tradition, and just so you know, a great source for seeing how Black authors connected to the classical tradition is the Norton Anthology for African-American Literature. Henry Louis Gates does a great job because he also is one who values the canon. He does a great job of putting footnotes wherever these different authors are referencing any literature, but you can just see there, like, this is from Shakespeare, this is from Aristotle. So if you're reading, say, Letter from a Birmingham Jail from that book, you'll see references to Plato, references to Aristotle, references to St. Augustine, and so, I mean, St. Augustine, I can't remember if it was Aristotle or not, but definitely St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas. You'll see those references in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which has almost too many references to count from the Western canon. Or like Raisin in the Sun, for example. There's a couple of lines in there from Lorraine Hansberry where, for example, there's a line where one of the characters calls another character Prometheus. Now, the character's name is actually Walter, but in a real mocking way, one of the characters, Benita's boyfriend, calls Walter Prometheus, which is a reference to Prometheus Bound. And so when I study now, my specialty, of course, is the African-American literature tradition and how it has been in conversation with the classical tradition. And this is a really valuable thing for today's, fraught environment. I mean, American education policy is polarized, and there are a lot of easy misunderstandings. And so, like, what gives you hope about the classics? So, I guess let me back that up. What are some concerning things that you've seen or experienced, some of the work that we've done together, or things that you've seen, experienced, because you have a wide following across the country? So what are some kind of concerns that we should be mindful of, and how do we get out of it? How do we create this generous space? I think, again, I'm going back to Mortimer Adler, and I really feel like his effort of creating that theory was to show how unifying this tradition can be. Like, he set this formula to show these authors that he's an expert in, because that's part of his heritage. He was able to say, these authors that I know of reference these works. We can take that formula and do the same thing. And then and this is why it's called the Great Conversation. It's not even called the Great Western Conversation. It could say that. It just says the Great Conversation. And I think one thing we can do to kind of battle the kind of way that we can tell, like, we can see it in the media, we can see it in the world, that this classical tradition, there's a war going on around it. Eric Adler, he's head of classics at the University of Maryland,
I think he's written a book about this battle for the classics. And you have different groups warring for owning it or rejecting it, trying to label it as it's conservative, it's white, it doesn't include us, it's white supremacist. All of these labels. I think that Mortimer Adler's work, I didn't mean for this to be an advertisement for Mortimer Adler, but it just keeps coming back to me. I think that Mortimer Adler's work shows us that it's not any of those labels. You know, hold on one second. My door open. I'm gonna close my door. Hold on one second.
Well, I'm really excited that we have a chance to learn from the source herself, because this is what Anika lives and breathes. So back to your point.
Yes, it's unifying. I think this word great, I always say a lot of times people, especially say if a white person uses the word great conversation, they're assuming it means, oh, you're saying it's better. But I think of the word great, and I even looked it up. The word great doesn't mean better. It can mean a lot of things. But one thing I take away from it is like when I say, let me give you a great big hug. Great means I think of it as all encompassing, welcoming, and you can embrace it all. This conversation has spanned centuries, time periods, races, cultures, heritage, and it can embrace all of us. And we see that this is true. When we read all of the literature that is in conversation with it from all over the world, we can see it is a great big hug that can kind of draw us all in together. And I know that people have other opinions of it, and I know that people have used this tradition to do very hurtful things. But I am choosing another way to look at it. Doesn't mean I'm not changing the tradition itself. I want to change our perspectives on it. And I also want to encourage us to stop arguing with those who want to hold on to the wrong perspective. It's really a waste of time to do that. I think we need to spend more of our time coming together, gathering those of us who see it in this embracing, hugging way that could draw us together. I want to encourage all of us to choose to stop focusing on the argument and focus on loving one another who see it in this way until we become stronger, that our voices become louder, and that the light we shine in this process will draw people to a better perspective.
It almost sounds with the words that you're using about the great conversation, the embrace, that you're actually, I mean, I think about the word hospitality,
Yeah.
that it's an invitation, and the word conversation implies that multiple views of a conversation is dialogical, right?
Yes.
And I think part of what makes what you're saying so compelling is that you're connecting the literature to the deeper questions that it asks about meaning and purpose and the good life.
Yes.
Which is why I suppose it's also called the humanities. This is the humane conversation. This is what human beings wrestle with.
Yeah.
And I know for myself, one of the sadnesses I feel about American education is the lack of access to those richer, deeper conversations that, at least in my experience, young people are hungry for.
Yes.
And before we, pivot the conversation, I just wondered if you could give one example of how these conversations have inspired the young people that you work with at Living Waters.
And I said Living Water, even the work I did at Howard University, and it doesn't even matter where the child is from. My dissertation even talks about this. Doesn't matter who they are, where they're from. Of course, at first, there's this rejection of it. Like, that's not about me. The authors don't look like me. But once I invite them into this great big hug of a conversation and we engage with this literature, I love Du Bois's perspective on it. He says, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not, right? Another part, he says, across the color line, I go arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, and he, what he's describing in that beautiful poetry at the end that's at the end of his essay called "Of the Training of Black Men," in Souls of Black Folk. He is describing what is possible with this great conversation. And so when my students at Living Water School or at Howard University, no matter where I go, I see this, as he calls it, rising above the veil. Let's say that veil to us, like it's a process of us teaching the next generation and ourselves that we can all be above the veil. That veil to me is this color line that has kind of oppressed us and messed all of our lives up, right? We tend to look at it as this is what was done to me, but it was what was done to us as human beings. This color line hurt all of us as human beings. And so I see this process of engaging in the great conversation with these ancient works and those who are in conversation with the ancient works, us taking that elevation above that color line, above the veil, that color line that blinds us from seeing our common humanity. And so when I bring my students into conversation with the canon, whether they are in college or K-12 education, I'm inviting them into that magical world that Du Bois describes. And if we keep doing that, what happens, and I see it in my own children, my 3 children, I see it in all students I work with, this veil that makes us angry, or this veil that makes us prejudiced or whatever. Once you engage in this common conversation, that veil is lifted and we see one another, right? We're no longer living in Ralph Ellison's world of invisible man, but we see one another as part of the human family. You're my brother, you're my sister. We have the same human experiences. Our blood is red, same color. Just the only thing that's different is our skin tone. But once we engage in this great conversation, we don't even see that. We see our human experiences. I'm not talking about color blindness. I'm not talking about erasure. But we don't see ourselves in the way society wants to label us. Instead, we are in conversation with, I'm gonna give a good example and then I'm gonna stop. This is a perfect personal example. So I'm starting to like, but I used to not like Jane Austen, right? I didn't like her, and people would talk about, have you read this book and Pride and Prejudice and so on and so forth? And I said, I don't see myself there. Like that's her books were one of those books that no matter how much I tried to open my brain and believe the best, I could not see myself in her books. Nothing about it connected to me until I read Pride and Prejudice again. And the scene where the mother was just, I've got to find my daughter some husbands. Now, I've seen this story plenty of times, right? And this is a really good example because you may have to read something more than once to see the common human experience. And once I saw that, I said, oh my goodness, if that wasn't my mother, she was just like, I gotta find a husband for you. She was on a mission. And I am not ashamed to say she found my husband. And she lets me remember every anniversary. Don't you forget how you met him. I know, mother. And she found me a good one, right? 16 years ago in a couple of weeks. And so that story, and even when the mother was weeping and crying about, I don't know what's going to happen to your father. I have no way of making sure you're going to be taken care of. I want to make sure you're going to be okay. And so that brought me into valuing, wait a minute, Jane Austen's stories may not be set in a culture and in a heritage that I connect with, but the human storyline definitely connects with me. So I want to ask you some questions, Ashley, and then I'm going to leave a few minutes for questions because I see Ruby has raised her hand. I feel like what we're talking about, Ashley, connects to your work in pluralism. And I know you've just come out with a book that deals with pluralism. And I love your perspectives on its connection to K-12 education and how we're teaching the next generation through just a very different lens and understanding. Can you share a little bit about your work?
Sure. So I've taught in the United States at almost every level, from pre-K all the way up to graduate school. But what I didn't know until I started studying it was that the way our country thinks about K-12 education is completely the opposite of how most countries, particularly most democracies, do. So, when I was being raised, it was public and private schools, this very clear division, public versus private. And as our school systems have diversified. We've got charters and tax credit funding in Washington, D.C., for example, they have 50% charters. There's still this sense of combat between different sectors, who's legitimate and who's not. Most democracies fund a wide variety of schools on equal footing and hold them all accountable for academic results. That's what educational pluralism is. It's a different structure for public education in which the government funds Jewish schools, Catholic schools, secular schools, Montessori schools that reflect the commitments of a pluralistic community that honors the differences about the ultimate questions. And at the same time, the best of those countries, the highest performing, require common content across all of them. And the liberal arts curriculum serves as the connective tissue. So listen, there are many ways to construct public education systems. My personal view, looking at the research and looking at what I believe about education, that it's not possible for education to be morally neutral. Anytime we hire a teacher or create an honor code or a disciplinary code, we're making normative claims. So instead of pretending that education can be morally neutral, we need to fund a variety of institutions. That's the pluralistic part. But we have to worry about social cohesion. And that's where this great conversation cuts across the differences. And so my most recent book is called Educational Pluralism and Democracy. And it explores not only this structure, but goes deep into the content and the role of content at unifying a country. And of course, I draw on E.D. Hirsch's work in Europe, in which he found that when France, which is pluralistic, France funds Catholic, Jewish, Muslim schools equally, that when France required the same liberal arts content across all of its schools, it closed the achievement gaps by 6th grade. And when they pulled back and said, we're going to do process and skills over content, those achievement gaps widened again. And this is just, so I do spend two chapters in my book talking about the, why our country walked away from the pluralism and the structure and why walked away from the liberal arts content. And I make the case that these things belong together. And so I guess lastly, I would just say I do spend a lot of time talking about the difference between exposure and indoctrination. So in our country, many parents feel very threatened by the presence of diverse perspectives and are very unaccustomed to learning about different views. We don't teach comparative religion and ethics in our country. We don't introduce kids to the great conversations in those questions. And so our adults feel sometimes alienated when they find their kids are learning it. But I'm just going to give one more example and then I'll stop. The Netherlands funds 36 different kinds of schools, from secular, Montessori, Waldorf, to religious, to all of. They even fund creationist schools. But children in the creationist schools have to demonstrate competent understanding of evolutionary theory at some point in secondary grades. It's not, they don't have to believe it's true. You can't compel belief, but they have to know what it says. In the same way, most of the European nations require comparative religion every year. So you may go to a Jewish day school, but you have to learn what Catholics believe. And it's not seen as a threat. So that is kind of, to your point about a generous space, that's what I'm hoping, is for a generous space where we're not pitting school types against each other and we're not afraid of these richer conversations.
That's so beautiful. There's so much I want to say to that I'm hoping I can illuminate, but it's such, you're so on point with that. We do that at the Living Water School. They do take a world religions class. They learn about other faiths, and it's how I was raised. Even my dad is a pastor, And I learned about other faiths from him, and it did not weaken my faith. It made me more compassionate, more empathetic, more willing to hear people's human experiences. But if anyone has a question they'd like to ask, please put it in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll take a couple of minutes, a few minutes to answer any questions you may have. Does anyone have a question you'd like to ask? Just feel free to put it in the chat. And if anyone here on the panel who's visiting on this side of Zoom, if you have a question you'd like to ask, please feel free to ask vocally if you want.
I just have one more comment to follow up on what you were saying, Anika, about the great conversation and the transformational power. PBS has a special on the Bard and Bard. It's called College Behind Bars, I think, but it's about Bard's prison initiative. And you see, it makes me weep every time I even think about it. The Bard professors having conversations about Moby Dick and about these rich texts and the depth. And I have to believe human beings are meant for that. And that we're lacking something when we don't have a place to explore those ideas.
Dr.
I just want to thank you for everything you're doing. I want to thank you, Anika, for hosting this and for creating this important and unique space. It's needed. We need more air in the room. We need more generosity.
Dr. Prather, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I just wanted to say I didn't put a question, and I know my colleague probably is in the same shape, into the box, because what I need to talk about now is going to require a whole day all by myself with you and Dr. Berner and others. I can't limit it to one thing, but just the remarks that you just made, both of you, are so illuminating. And as you said, Ashley, just absolutely essential. And what occurred to me is that the classics require the great conversation.
They do.
We're not doing it because they actually literally require us to have a conversation to get to the root, to get to the roots, to get to the substance of the thing. And that's what makes this conversation so essential, because we're not just talking about trading opinions. We're talking about what is this thing in light of this work? And that gives us the basis for a conversation.
I love that. We're not just trading opinions, you know, and I'm going to introduce Claudia and Onyema in a second. And as we just kind of bridge over to you all, I do want to say this. Diana asked in the Q&A, her question was, how do we help people understand that schools are normative spaces, but that does not mean indoctrination? And this is what I think will create more love. Like if you look on social media and just in the media overall, it's very hateful. And that's because we are literally rejecting one another because we believe and look and think and see things differently. Yes. This process of the liberal arts tradition, the classical tradition, classics, I feel if we train the next generation and even ourselves in that, it will create more empathy for other people's human experiences. And it doesn't indoctrinate. Matter of fact, I have found that it's made my own children's faith stronger, because they understand. They're not just, I have to believe this because mommy and daddy said I believe this, and this is what my church believes, but they're able to take what they believe and bring it in conversation with somebody else believes, and are able to make an educated choice for themselves. So I've just found that it is fundamental. It's something that every child deserves the right to have. Every human being deserves the right to have.
But I think that's why the plural structure works so well with the liberal arts curriculum, because parents are going to feel more comfortable with their children's being exposed to all different kinds of perspectives and beliefs if they know it's being interpreted through a lens with which they're comfortable, because we all we have to have a lens. So, you know, one can imagine a school that is a Marxist school. And just the way that Catholic schools teach catechism from kindergarten on up, a Marxist school teaching, you know, economic determinism and so forth. But those kids who are learning that, I would say, would still need to engage with different understandings of the human experience, different
Yes.
historical mechanisms. And you know, that's the kind of both and
Yeah.
of rich content that can feel threatening, but
Yes.
we need to be able to say, this is where I think American adults
Yes.
need some support and help. You know, I
Yes.
think about all the parents who are concerned about certain things with the curriculum, and parents need a little bit more hand-holding sometimes to say,
Yes.
learning about the Quran does not mean we're trying to make your child Islamic.
Yes.
It's fundamental knowledge for the sake of the next generation.
Exactly. Exactly. I'm going to stop recording so we can end this segment, because these recordings will be up on our YouTube channel called Redefining Classics on YouTube. The link is also on the website, www.redefiningclassics.org. And you'll be able to see this first talk. And now I'm going to